kind of evolution ideas and evidence. And this is just to give an overview as to why we now accept Darwin's theory of evolution as the best account we have of the origins of the natural world and some of the features therein. So what I'm going to do is have a little bit of a preamble, talking about the kind of universe of discourse we're in, what the rules of the game are, and look at some of the ideas that are bound up in Darwin's theory of evolution, and then look at the evidence as it was available to Darwin and evidence that's become available since then. So the first issue we have to look at is, what is evolution the answer to? Evolution is the answer. What was the question? There are various things when we look at the natural world and we look at the living world that spring to mind. The living world has changed dramatically over time. So if we went back 100 million years, kind of rules of chemistry and physics would stay the same, but the world of life would be quite considerably different. We'd have these dinosaurs wandering around, doing sorts of species unnoticed. And it would still be spinning on its axis, but the world of life would be quite different. Another question which particularly exercised Darwin was when you look at life, you see such a huge degree of variety out there, all sorts of different things going on, different appearances. But actually, when you scratch the surface, when people study the shape and the behaviours of living organisms, they find actually there's commonalities beneath the surface that are not evident. Darwin actually used this phrase, nature profligate in variation but niggard in innovation, to describe this phenomenon. The other question that we have to address is this appearance of design in nature. So why is it that things look as if they are well fitted, well adapted to their environment? Why does a polar bear have that wonderful white hair that actually camouflages against the snow? How is that eagle able to have the spy rabbit with this kind of camera eye a mile away? And why do you get this kind of thing where you get, this is actually a plant? Looks like there's a fly on that plant. That's all just the plant pretending to be a fly to attract flies to it, pollinate. So why do we have contrivances in nature seeming so perfectly to resemble the tools, the machines that man makes, designed after that? So why does the heart look like a pump? Why does the eye look like a camera? Why do our tendons and ligaments look like ropes and pulleys when you look at our anatomy? Now, before we start, as I say, I have to have a preamble just to say how science is done, what science is, if you like. So the way in which we currently see science is that you have a number of observations out there in the world, like the kinds of thing we spoke about, which are in need of explanation. And what we do is we formulate explanations, given this grand word, hypotheses, to provide an explanatory framework for why those observations are the way they are. And then these hypotheses are tested. And as we continue to test those hypotheses, as they become more solid, perhaps they become deeper and broader, they then consolidate into theories. Now, the first way in which we might do this intuitively is to actually go and test our theory. Go and test our hypothesis, turn it into a theory. And philosophers of science have this particular anecdote about, if you want to go and prove that all swans are white, you can go out there and you can go into a park in Malvern, you can look at the swans and you say, oh look, there's 10 swans, they're all white. You can then get in the car and you drive up to Birmingham, you go to a park in Birmingham, you can see a load of swans and they're all white. And you go all up from length to depth of country. You can collect hundreds of thousands of observations, all in line with your theory that all swans are white. And that idea of verifying your theory by continually collecting new observations has some merit to it. But there is a problem with that, which was pointed out by Karl Popper in the early part of the 20th century, which is that actually you can collect as many observations as you like, in support of your theory, but one observation that's contrary is enough to shatter your disprove it. And so he made much of the fact that we should be looking to see if there are ways in which we can falsify our hypothesis rather than prove it. And so a single observation of a black swan, if you got in an aeroplane and you went to Australia, there are black swans in Australia, you would be able to falsify your hypothesis. And this has now grown into a kind of hallmark of what we consider to be science, particularly hypothesis-driven science, which is that your hypothesis has to be framed in such a way that you can falsify it. There has to be some way in which you can do experiments or whatever, or take additional observations which will show that your theory is false. Another key point that stems out of this is this provisional nature of scientific discoveries. So we can look at the idea of the swans. Provisionally, our theory is true until it's disproven. Newton's idea of mechanics was true until there were observations that didn't fit, and Einstein came along and gave a broader theory. Usually what happens, though, is not that theories are just disproven and thrown away, it's actually that they're shown to be true for many things, but there are some exceptions, and then you build a larger framework in which you can explain those other things. There's a kind of tension because we all have to keep in mind the provisional nature of scientific truth, but we also, if you look at it, some theories actually do solidify into facts. So it's funny the way that the theory of evolution, particularly in the US among creationists there, they have a real go at the theory of evolution. It's not a fact, it's a theory. But there are many other things which started off as theories that are now pretty much accepted as facts by all of us. So we talk about atomic theory to talk about the idea that the world is made of atoms, and that Dawkins came along with these ideas that you could explain certain bits of chemistry by the fact that there are atoms. Well, although that was once a theory, I think pretty much all of us accept that atoms really do exist, they are facts. Similarly, in my line of work, we talk about the germ theory of infection, which came in the latter part of the 19th century as an explanation for infectious diseases, that there are these minuscule organisms that you cannot see with the normal eye. You have to have a microscope to see them, and it's the movement of those from one person to another that actually accounts for infection. That's called the germ theory. But nobody says that's just a theory now. We all accept that germs really do exist, that there really are bacteria and they really do cause disease. And it's also worth stressing that theories are actually better than facts in a sense, in that they include the facts, but they also include the explanations for the facts. So in fact, theory is a better thing than the fact. So that's just a little bit of a preamble there as to what we're talking about. Another issue that we follow in science is this idea of parsimony, sometimes called Occam's razor, which is that we prefer the simplest explanation, the explanation that requires the least number of assumptions. Sorry?
From a theologian.
From a theologian, of course, yes, exactly. So William of Ockham was a monk back in the 13th century, I think. And you could argue that, that there are, when you're watching Crossroads, there are actually the people inside the television that are doing all the movements and actually acting all that part out, but they spontaneously disappear when you open the setup and look inside, and they're replaced with those transistors. You could make an explanation like that, but it's stretching credulity. It's much easier to accept. Well, actually, it's all the electronics that are making that image, and there's nothing funny going on. There could be leprechauns at the end of the garden, there could be monsters under the bed, but for the purposes of simplicity, we ignore that. The other thing is that the scientific method makes this presumption of methodological naturalism. So it looks for natural explanations about the world out there and pushes those natural explanations as far as they can go without assuming the existence or the non-existence of the supernatural. Now, in that sense, methodological naturalism, you could kind of say it's an agnostic view. It's not making any claim at all about supernatural events. parodied this cartoon here. Like, basically, scientists will say, well, actually, let's see if we can find another explanation for that. Rather than say there's thunder going on because Zeus is unhappy and he's shaking the clouds, we can come up with a naturalistic explanation for that, and we can keep pushing that as far as we go. And this is what's happened. People are going back to the early first second of the universe, the first millisecond of the universe. Physicists keep pushing it. Methodological naturalism is not the same as philosophical naturalism. To be a scientist, you don't have to believe there is no supernatural, but you have to do your job. You have to work on your day-to-day basis, put it to one side. Now, there are some showstoppers in these kind of arguments. There's an argument that comes from a guy who lived not far from here in Worcester, Philip Henry Goss. He wrote this book in the mid-19th century called Omphalos. And he was particularly bothered by this question of the umbilicus in Adam and Eve, their belly buttons. If you go and look at all the paintings of Adam and Eve, sometimes they have, well, I think most of the time they have an umbilicus. But why do they have an umbilicus? Because they were never in the womb. They didn't have to be fed from the placenta. So he came up with the idea, well, actually, when they were made, God would have made them as perfect humans. And perfect humans, the kind of archetype of a human, has an umbilicus. So God would have given an umbilicus, even though they never had an umbilical cord and never were connected to a placenta, just because that would have made them look perfect. And in the same way, if you went to the trees in the Garden of Eden, according to this view, you could look at the trees, cut through a tree, and you would see tree rings, which, if we saw a tree out there, we would say that's evidence of previous generations of growth, previous seasons of growth. Or thin one, oh, that was a harsh winter. A thick one, oh, that was a nice year. Same would have been true in the Garden of Eden. And so what he said was that, yeah, God made everything look as if there was this past history, when he just brought it into existence, but there wasn't. Now that, you can take that argument wherever you like. Some people say there's a parody religion called Last Thursdayism, which is that God created the world last Thursday, and made us all feel as if we have these memories of growing up, and having a childhood, and having parents, and all that, and going to school. But those are just memories that have been put in our head, and in fact the world started on last Thursday. Now, philosophically, you can't really escape from that. It's just like, well, if you believe that, then you'll believe anything, but we can't really have a discussion. Similarly, the Matrix film is an illustration of the idea that maybe the whole universe is just a simulation. We're all living inside a computer. We're not really here. It's not really physically here in some sense. It's all just a simulation. And obviously, in a computer, you could have, again, started the program running last Thursday with the appearance of everything from the night before. This guy, Boltzmann, he looked at kind of fluctuations in quantum mechanics and said that particles could just appear in the quantum universe. They can just come into existence. And that's kind of allowed by the rules of quantum mechanics. And if you wait long enough, in fact, whole brains could actually just pop into existence. I kid you not, there are philosophers out there that worry about this kind of thing, so-called Boltzmann brains that just pop into existence. There are other philosophers who worry about the idea of, are we all just brains in vats, but we're not really experiencing this world as it is and wandering around and kicking things and whatever. We're actually a brain in a vat being fed all these sensory inputs from outside. And of course, you could go one step further and say we could be a Boltzmann brain in a vat, but basically the whole brain and the vat all came into existence out of common culture. Now, obviously, all these things give you a good reason. You could believe all this and not believe in evolution. I think George Orwell once said, as a put down to someone who came up with some highfalutin idea, he said, you have to be a real intellectual to believe that. Similarly, Samuel Johnson, when he was contesting the idea of idealism, which was that the real world doesn't exist, it's all just ideas in our head, he contested it by just kicking a stone and said, I refute it thus. I think that has to be our viewpoint if we're going to move forward. So, I mentioned earlier about Darwin's theory of evolution, all these things feeding into it. Perhaps one that we haven't mentioned before is Paley's Natural Theology, which was one of the books that Darwin did study while he was at Cambridge, which was basically trying to prove God's existence and beneficence by looking at the natural world and looking at how well things are made in the natural world as evidence of that. And so I think Darwin, he actually used Paley as his kind of foil for the rest of his life. He was trying to show that Paley wasn't the best explanation for what we saw around you. Okay. Oh, one other thing that's worth saying is that it's quite odd that Darwin gets all this bad rap for like, oh, he's taken God out of the picture and all that sort of stuff. But in fact, it was Newton who was the one that said, well, you don't need God to explain the motions of the planets. We have these rules, we have these gravity, these forces, these laws. And all that Darwin was trying to do was generalise the kind of framework that Newton had applied in the physical sciences to biology. It doesn't quite work that straightforwardly, but that was what Darwin was trying to do. But nonetheless, Darwin gets all the blame. And in America, it's deeply personal. Darwin, such a long time after his death, is still actually known as kind of almost the Antichrist. So within Darwin's theory of evolution, there are embedded lots of different ideas. It's not just one thing that he came up with. And this just skates very quickly over the surface of some of those ideas embedded within his theory. So he came up with the idea that there is a mutability of species, that species do indeed change. They haven't always been the same. He also came up with, as we mentioned in the earlier talk, the idea of non-progressive branching. I'll say more about these things in a minute. Natural selection was one of his other big ideas. It's not essential to believe all the other stuff. In some ways, you can argue that the idea of non-progressive branching evolution and common descent is a separate thing from natural selection. He also took on board extinction, evolutionary gradualism, biogeography, population thinking. All these things are buried inside his theory. Ernst Mayr was one of the 20th century's most prominent evolutionists, and he lived for over 100 years, and he actually wrote a book on what evolution is, and he tried to unpick Darwin's ideas and say, well, what were the key ideas buried in Darwin's evolution. So, as I said, the non-constancy of species, the modern conception of evolution, that things do change over time. The idea of branching evolution, and this implies this idea of common origin, unique single origin, common descent of all species, all living things on Earth from that common origin. Darwin didn't actually say that there was a common origin for everything. He speculated that there might be, but he never was quite that dogmatic. But he did say that, for plants, there's probably a common origin for plants, there's probably a common origin for all animals and so forth. Now, what he was kicking against there was this idea of this scala naturae, this kind of inevitable progress, this ladder of life, where life was moving towards greater perfection over time, and that, if you like, we are the pinnacle of existence. Life has been evolving towards us. Darwin was much more interested in this branching evolution that comes out in his notebook. So you still see this idea of this particular picture at the top here. It's called the March of Progress. And it lines up. I think it was back in the 30s. This idea that that there were primitive apes, and then there were less primitive apes, and then eventually it got to us. And it was all very straightforward. That's where it was going. That Darwin, back in the 1830s, in his first sketch, made clear that no, it's just a bushy mess. And we now recognise when we look at the known species on our lineage since we diverged from chimpanzees, when we try and put them together into any kind of sense, we really recognise that it's pretty bushy, it's pretty uncertain, there's not any clear, it's not clear evidence that this was the ancestor of this, and was the ancestor of this, and then that turned into us. And so that notion is buried inside Darwin's theory. Darwin was particularly keen to stress that evolution should be gradual. there's no discontinuity. So in previous ideas about evolution, there were these ideas of grand catastrophes that wiped the whole Earth free of life and it all started again. And his idea was, no, it just continually, gradually goes on. And it's, he was particularly taken with the idea of the steady accumulation of small change having huge effects. So if you look around you, if you can see a child running, let's say. You can't see a child growing. You can't actually see a child growing. You can see another micron taller today, and then this minute, and then another micron. But nonetheless, all of us have had children. You can see that they do grow over time. That same kind of idea over long. If you go to a cathedral, you can see as people have stepped on a step. It slowly is. You know, you would think all those people, that's hard rock, and people treading on that step, or praying on a particular place, or whatever, kissing the Blarney Stone, surely that really doesn't make any difference. But you come back, and after a few centuries, you see those effects. He said that the mechanism of evolution is largely natural selection, that Darwin never said everything is explained by natural selection. He makes that quite clear in Origin. And he also introduced this idea of historicity into science. So the idea that in some ways biology is a historical subject. It's not like chemistry and physics, where certainly in evolutionary biology we're looking back in time and coming up with explanations of things that have already happened, as much as explanations of what's there in the natural world right now. So this is the origin of species. Here are its various chapters. As it appeared in the first edition in 1859. Well, I should say, before I move on, has anyone actually read The Origin of Species? A few people. Okay, so you're obviously very devoted individuals, and as this man here pointed out, maybe slightly autistic to actually work your way through all that lot. But to save you time, what I've done is I've put The Origin of Species here on one slide. It's a one-page summary, the sort of thing you could wear on a T-shirt. And we can quickly go through that now, if you like. See, how are we doing for time? All right. So, plant animals vary under domestication, show astonishing variation, similar to artificial selection. This is called artificial selection. Same kind of thing happens in nature. We get the struggle for existence, metaphorical or direct, fiercest between individuals of the same species. You have that struggle for resistance, you have variants, better suited to the environment, they will have a better chance of surviving, so will their offspring, where the variation is inherited. And by analogy with artificial selection, this principle can be called natural selection. And there's sexual selection, where the same thing's going on between selecting on cases of sexual preference. Obviously, natural selections that work all the time. This affinities of all the living organisms, like a great tree. Don't understand. Back in his day, we didn't understand much about the causes and laws of variation, but that's my line. And natural selection soldiers on nonetheless. I mean, this was the great insight that Darwin didn't really understand genetics at all, but he nonetheless came up with this idea, which actually turns out to work, even though you don't know. Points out we don't see transitional forms in nature because the newer, better ones outcompete the older ones, but you can see gradations. Spent a lot of time worrying about instincts and the fact they're subject to power selection. Worried about hybrids and why is it that hybrids between species are sterile often. Geological time so vast and the fossil working record so imperfect that we can scarcely expect to see transitional fossils. But he says that the theory of descent with modification, which was his preferred phrase rather than evolution, provides the best explanation for that. And it also explains all these other things here. And he's kind of saying, although it stretches our imagination, to think about this as being the explanation. In fact, if we look at the way in which natural selection will play out in the world, it's an inevitable consequence of that. And he basically also says that it's a better explanation than special creation, and it makes biology actually more interesting than physics. So, what has he got in natural selection, varied in natural selection? We have these ideas of reproduction, variation, and inheritance. So when we're focusing on reproduction, one of the things that Darwin noticed was the fecundity of nature. Now, many of you probably have ponds in your garden. Any time now, you're going to see frog spawn in there. We see every year in our garden. What you see in a frog spawn is you see thousands and thousands of eggs of those frogs. So presumably 2 frogs have done that and produced all those thousands of eggs. Now, if all of those eggs turn into tadpoles, and all those tadpoles turn into frogs, it wouldn't be long before the whole of Malvern was just covered in frogs. That whole planet would be covered in frogs. Every generation they went 1,000 or more of them. So Darwin kind of pointed out, well, obviously, we've got this fecundity of nature, but not everything is surviving to the next generation to reproduce. And therefore, there is a struggle for existence. And one of the things that Darwin kind of pointed out, really, was that in that struggle for existence, it's not necessarily that the lion is, well, the gazelle is struggling with the lion. In fact, we're all struggling with those things that are most closely related to us. Because we're all struggling to survive and gain access to the things we need, whether it's food or shade or water or escape from predators. In fact, there's a little joke which illustrates the point, which is that at the zoo, one evening, there were 2 of the zookeepers wandering around the zoo, and they noticed that the lion's cage, the door is open, and the lion is actually coming out of the cage towards them. One says to the other one, "Oh dear, we're in trouble now. I don't know what we're going to do." And the other one says, "Well, I don't know about you, but I'm going to run for it." And the first one says, "But hang on, you don't be silly. A human can't outrun a lion." To which he replies, "I don't have to outrun the lion, I just have to outrun you." And that's the idea, that basically one of Darwin's insights was that struggle for existence is going on between individuals, very closely related individuals. All of these individual eggs in the frog spawn and the tadpoles will be struggling with each other to get resources. So there's this struggle for existence, differential survival. And then Darwin said, well, if there's variation under nature, and he pointed out under domestication, then some of those variants are going to be better able to survive and go on to the next generation and reproduce. Now, sometimes that variation will just be random and it won't affect anything afterwards. But sometimes that variation will actually be inherited from one generation to another. So if you have inheritance of those useful variations, then you have natural selection. So this has been called non-random survival of random variants by Dawkins, Charles Caught on the Wing by Kaufman. But let's just say a new ice age came, and all the hares that are living around this area were suddenly having to cope with a snow-covered landscape. What would happen if we look at our natural hare population? We've got some of them that have lighter coloured hair than others. Than others, as a result of all that. Just the way life is, there is this variation. In fact, it's an interesting point that Darwin settles on that variation. In many other areas of life, variation is a real nuisance. If you're working in a factory and you're building screws, let's say, you want every one of them to be the same. If you're a physicist, then you say effectively every electron is the same as every other electron in the whole universe. Darwin says, no, biology is not like that. It's messy. It's variation is actually there all the time. And that is the seed corn of evolution. So we have that variation. The unfavourable variants die before reproducing. And the ones that are left to reproduce are going to be, on average, slightly lighter in their fur colour. And they are then going to have another generation of offspring. And in that generation, the ones that are slightly lighter are going to be favoured more, until the whole population is shifted towards having a lighter coat. It may take a few generations, but that is the trajectory in which the population will go without anyone guiding it, without any conscious thing going on. It's just the result of this process. Okay, so that's almost like the preamble to everything, the ideas about evolution. What about the evidence for it? And I'm going to have to move quickly. So these are some of the things I'm going to take you through. So natural selection in action. Do we ever see this in real life? we do. Sadly, in my line of work, we see it all the time. This is from the Independent the week before last. One of my colleagues from the University of Birmingham interviewed in the Independent about the risk of antibiotic-resistant organisms, the antibiotic-resistant E. coli causing bloodstream infections. And so we see all the time, when we bring in a new antibiotic, a golden window of opportunity where things are okay for a while, and then within a few years, we start to see more and more resistant organisms in patients. In fact, you can see this even within a single patient. So that if we have a patient with tuberculosis and we give them an antibiotic, there is an even chance, about 50% chance, that they will get better to start with, but then they will relapse with a resistant strain. And what's happened is that there may be 1 in a billion of the bacteria in that patient's body that is resistant at the outset. You kill off all of them bar that one, but then give it a few more months, and that one grows to be a billion again, and the patient relapses. You see the same sorts of things with insects and rats, with pesticides. Rats become resistant to warfarin, that kind of stuff. Rabbits for myxomatosis. Sometimes we see this is a good thing. So you have a spill of some noxious substance, you sometimes will find bacteria and other organisms growing in the environment afterwards that actually able to resist that substance or even degrade that substance and get rid of it. So when you have an oil spill, you will select for organisms that can actually degrade the oil. We'll see this in other situations. Overfishing, you see that the fish populations change. The body size decreases as they're getting over. Having shorter times of maturity, having to have this live fast, die young lifestyle just to reproduce. And we look at the way in which hunting and poaching decimate population. We see in elephants that their tusk sizes have declined steadily over 150 years because the poachers are obviously always going for the ones with the larger tusks. Now, I guess that's artificial selection, not natural selection. It's just showing you how these kind of changes can play out over generations. There have been various examples that have been put forward in the literature. There's the so-called peppered moths. This idea of industrial melanism, that there's a particular species of moth here which has variants which are dark and variants which are light grey in colour. And this guy Kettlewell did experiments not far from here in Bourneville, showing that there was a correlation between the colour of the moths and the kind of discoloration of the trees. So Birmingham was once an industrial area. We don't see it nowadays, but it was once an area that was heavily industrialised, and the trees there were very dark and with soot. And in that area, you would see the darker form. In other areas in Dorset, where it was rural, you would see the lighter form. And then if you put each form in the opposite environment, you could see that they were not so well camouflaged. House sparrows, since Darwin's time, we've seen house sparrows diversify dramatically. So there was a guy in New York who had this misguided idea that native New Yorkers should be able to see every bird that is mentioned in Shakespeare. And so he deliberately went, took a load of species from England and brought them over to America where they were not native, house sparrows were one of them. And there was this explosive spread across the North American continent, and in fact across all of many of the British colonies. And you've got this rapid evolution of different varieties, different races of sparrows. And in Hawaii, they've diversified the most. They're kind of turning brown, they've lost their dark patches. So the experiment that's been done by this guy John Endler, looking at Trinidadian guppies. So if you look at these guppies in the state of nature, the colourful male guppies are the ones that are very attractive to the females. But of course, having all that colourful display also makes them conspicuous to predatory fish. So when you look in nature, if there are no predators around, then the guppies are able to be as brightly coloured as they wish, and that's what you see. If there are predators around, then the male guppies are duller. And what Endler did was actually take a situation where there were no predators, and there were lots of brightly coloured guppies, and then introduced predators, and within a few generations he saw the evolution of this population shifting towards the duller forms of the goat. Now this is an interesting experiment. This is the so-called high runner mouse. So this guy Ted Gardner, what he did was he bred mice that would run faster and faster on the treadmill. And you can see there's a control female who's just chilling out. There's the one on the left there who's completely balmy and going round and round and round. Those high runner mice will run 3 times further per day than your average laboratory mouse because they've been selected for that. Again, this is artificial selection, I guess, you could argue, but it just shows the power of these selective processes. In fact, these mice have effectively got a form of ADHD, and when you give them Ritalin, they actually return to being like normal mice. In my line of work, this guy called Lenski who does experiments on bacteria, where he just subcultures bacteria for years after years after years, and then looks to see what happens to the populations, how they adapt to environments in the laboratory, to using different sugars, that kind of stuff. Basically, there is all this amazing plasticity there in nature that is brought out by these selective processes. This guy, Michael Rose, has bred fruit flies that live longer and longer and longer, and the Methuselah fly, which lives to substantially longer than the average fly. If we look at variation within domestication, again, this was another one of Darwin's ideas to show really how plastic nature is out there. Things aren't compartmentalized as this is a species that stays the same. He spent a lot of time looking at domesticated pigeons, but nowadays I guess we would look at things like dogs. So the difference between a Chihuahua and a Great Dane. If we didn't know about the history of breeds in dogs, dispassionate, disinterested biologists, taxonomists would come along and probably put these into different species. You can get interspecies hybrids as well. So there are these ligers, tigons, mules, and there's a liger here, which is crossed between a lion and a tiger. Usually these are not fertile. So that maintains the barrier between species. It goes to show that species are not absolutely immutable, they can be changed. Another thing we see in nature are these so-called ring species, where you have a ring of species surrounding a central area where the species is not present. And as you go and look around that ring, the population at point 1 here can breed with the population at 2. Population at 2 can breed with the population at 3. 4, 3 to 4, 4 to 5, 5 to 6. When you get back to 7, 7 has now diversified so much that it cannot breed with the population at 1. And this is what's known as a ring species. And this just goes to show you how variation can occur geographically. And it's not much of a stretch of imagination to then play this kind of variation out over time, and you can see how one species can turn into another. Or you can track a trajectory between us and a chimpanzee, where we go back 6 million years to our ancestor, and then 6 million years up to the chimpanzee. And it's hard. At what point would you say that is no longer a human, that is now a chimpanzee? It's a bit like I mentioned child growing. When does a child turn into an adult? When does one species turn into another? Obviously they do change, but there's not one moment where you can draw a line and say that categorically is that moment. That child becomes an adult at 2:53 p.m. on a particular day. That it is artificial. We do that for kind of law and stuff on your 18th birthday, but still we have to recognise that it's an artificial step. Speciation has actually been observed in the wild and in the laboratory. Particularly among plants, there's quite a few cases of this. If they double the number of chromosomes, then you can actually get 2 species to actually crossbreed that wouldn't otherwise crossbreed and give rise to a new species that's not capable of breeding with either of the progenitors, but can breed with other members of its own species. So here are some examples of that here. Of course, we look at the fossil record. We mentioned that in the first talk. Extinction is a fact of life. There are many things out there that we see in the fossil record that have no living representatives. geologists have now come up with, well, even in Darwin's time, they've come up with this idea of succession. So that if you go back and look at geological time, you can say that these sediments are laid down after these sediments, and so on, backwards. And if you go back through the various geological time periods, you see generally that more complex things occur later in the fossil record, simple things occur earlier in the fossil record. And the famous evolutionary biologist J.S. Haldane was once asked, what would falsify evolution? He said, well, if we found a rabbit in the Precambrian, that would pretty much, fossil rabbit in the Precambrian, that would be a clincher. Of course, anyone who really knows how geologists work would say, well, they'd find a reason to, they'd say, oh, well, it's not from those sediments, it must have fallen down into sediments or something like that. But, there is, it's clear that there was this succession of forms even in Darwin's time. Let's leave form out even more sense. Since Darwin's time, we've seen many transitional forms have been described. So initially there was this idea that birds and dinosaurs were related. That we now recognise that birds really are a subset of dinosaurs. You can't define dinosaurs without including birds within that taxonomic group. And then people said, well, some of the dinosaurs, the things that we, the non-avian dinosaurs, the dinosaurs aren't birds. Why haven't they got feathers? Turns out they have. You look at the fossil record, you see many feathered dinosaurs. You can look at the evolution of the whale, and you can look back at ancestors of the whale which have adaptations to an aquatic environment but still have some of the signs of their terrestrial ancestry. Does anyone know what the closest living terrestrial mammal is to a whale? It's actually the hippopotamus. And people come up with this idea of the Whippo theory. Basically, the closest ancestors to whales are hippos. It's a bit counterintuitive, but that's what the evidence tells us. Say more about what kind of evidence. This thing here is Tiktaalik. It's been described as a fishopods, an intermediate form between fish and the kind of things we are, tetrapods, terrestrial animals with 4 limbs. It is a fish, but it's got a kind of amphibian-like skull. Its limbs are actually built on the same kind of bony kind of framework as our limbs are. And if we look in human evolution, I mean, one of the great surprises in recent decades is that human evolution, we stood up long before we got big brains. It used to be thought, oh, the big brains came first, and then we stood up, and the siblings came together. But you can actually look back and you can see ancestral forms with small brains that nonetheless walk around on 2 limbs. I mentioned earlier that Darwin's big insights came from what he saw in South America. Why were there these 2 South American ostriches, rheas as they were, that were in different geographical regions but adjacent? In fact, there was a river that separated the 2 populations. Darwin to say, well, how can you explain that? Why would there be that? And why was it that extinct animals resemble the living in the same locality? Why is it you get armadillos in South America, and you get sloths in South America, and then you get fossils of the same thing in South America, but you only get the living and the extant forms of those things in the same continent? Also, if you think about it, you could argue, well, things live where they live, because that's the best place for them to live. That's where they do best. Darwin said, well, hang on, if we look at the Galapagos Islands, these are islands off the coast, in the middle of the ocean, or the Cape Verde Islands, they have quite different animals that live there and plants that live there. And in fact, the animals that live in the Galapagos, when you look carefully, they more closely resemble the animals that live in South America, and the Cape Verde ones more closely resemble those from Africa. It doesn't quite make sense to say, well, it's because of the kind of climate and the habitat there. And in fact, if we can draw out a more general thing, why is it we have no cows in Australia until Europeans went there? Cows can live there perfectly well. Lots of Australians make a living out of farming. And in fact, kangaroos, why don't they live here? Well, they can live here. In fact, it was in the news a few weeks ago that there was some escaped in, I think it was in Dorset, or no, in Devon. One of them escaped. I think there were some wallabies that lived for a long time in the Pennines, completely free. So you may have heard of the koipu, which is a South American animal that lived in East Anglia for many years. Grey squirrels, they've become a pest here. So you can't say, well, it's because everything's adapted to where it lives, it's the best place for it, because obviously grey squirrels do much better here than the rest of them. Also, when we look at the way in which diversity is packaged out across the planet, it's not even. There are some places on the planet where we have these biodiversity hotspots. So if we want to look at where are marsupials in the world, well, almost all of them are in Australia. There's a few in New Guinea, and there's a few in South America, but some are now in New Zealand that have been introduced by humans. But generally, all the marsupials are in Australia. But that's where you find all that huge variation in the marsupials. You find marsupial wolves and marsupial moles and all these things that look like the kind of animals we see here superficially, but they're all marsupial. If you go to New Zealand, you see lots and lots of flightless birds. And, this phrase Moa's art has been described, been used to describe New Zealand. There's these flightless birds called Moa, wiped out by Polynesians. Darwin noticed when he went to the Galapagos, there are no mammals in the Galapagos. Just where instead of mammals, there's just all these reptiles. South America, how do we account for the distinct forms there? And Hawaii, why is it that if we look at, say, fruit flies, we find 2/3 of about 1,000 species of fruit fly, 600 of them are found in Hawaii. What sense can we make of that? Except if we say, well, things that were created where they belong and ordered. I mean, Darwin pointed out you could come up with the explanation, well, the creator just liked it that way. Darwin pointed out that's not a scientific explanation. And Darwin's explanation was that these kind of biodiversity hotspots were, if you like, isolated. The land was created new, isolated away from other land masses, and then occasionally you've got seeding of these species, and then they come into those islands and radiate out. Fast and forward. So groups within groups. So this is Carl Linnaeus, Carl von Linné. He lived in Sweden. He came up with this classification of life, which we now more or less stick to, the so-called Linnaean classification. And the idea here is that there's a hierarchy. So I am a mammal. I'm a primate. I'm an anthropoid ape. I'm a human. I can be classified at different levels in the hierarchy. And within mammals, cats and dogs will be found, and within vertebrates we also have fish. But there is this perfect kind of hierarchy that we see in nature. When you look carefully, you can classify everything into one of these hierarchical groups or another. And you never get something that's half man, half potato. Maybe some students would fit that regard, I'd say, but you never see something that just crosses boundaries and completely arbitrary. And these kind of deep similarities are obviously excellent. Whales and mammals, humans and primates. Even Linnaeus classified humans as primates. Before any evolution, he chucked us in with all the monkeys and the apes. Compare this with, say, books. Let's say we want to classify books. It becomes very arbitrary. There is no way in which you can perfectly classify books in an objective way that nobody's going to disagree about. So, you have in the Dewey Decimal Classification system, Dalton pointed out that it's actually quite a biased system, because Christianity gets like a whole big number, and you can have all this space for Christianity. All the other religions get put into a little decimal point afterwards. But even then, where are you going to put books of Jews for Jesus? Messianic Jews, where do they go? Do they go to Christianity, or do you classify them under Judaism? You've got to make a choice. Where are you going to classify? Where do you classify a book like this, Religion for Atheists? Does that go under atheism, or does it go under religion? These kind of arbitrary decisions are absolutely... You can classify books by their cover. Some libraries you go and you find the big books, the ones that won't fit on the shelves in one place. You find the ones with big print. It's all arbitrary. Whereas actually the funny thing is that when biologists look at the natural world, they don't have this problem. Everything fits into a place nicely. And Darwin's explanation was of was that it was modification twinned with repeating branching gives rise to these lineages. And this is the explanation of life's natural hierarchy. And in fact, in the Origin of Species, the only figure he used was this figure here, showing this branching phylogenetic tree. If we look at life, there are other things that just don't make any sense if you sort of think, well, that life is perfectly designed to be like that. You get blind animals, live in caves, that live in dark environments. But many of them actually, when they develop, they start making eyes. That program kicks up, an eye starts to form, and then sometime in their development stops, and it degenerates. How do you explain this? It's very hard to explain that in the other way. To say, well, they are the descendants of animals with eyes, and the only way that evolution found to get rid of those eyes quickly was to abort the process partway through. Maybe it was just too difficult, too radical to come up with a mutation that would actually turn off the whole business of making an eye from the beginning. But you find this time and again. Fish, salamanders, moles, insects have these degenerate eyes, or eyes that form and then degenerate. We also see these vestigial features in other settings. We see flightless birds have wings. Flightless cormorant there, it's got these wings. What are those wings doing on it? I know you can argue that sometimes wings like that might have another function, that maybe ostriches use their wings to scare other ostriches or set them display. You know, they're pretty intelligent as well. We see vestigial legs and pelvic bones in cetaceans, snakes, lizards. So, you know, you can actually dissect a whale and you can see that there are these bones with the leg, the hind limbs, when in fact there are no hind limbs there. You can get lizards which no longer require to mate because they're what we call parthenogenetic. The females give rise to more females. But nonetheless, they show mating behaviours, like a spayed dog. You know, sometimes shows mating behaviour. It's not going to do it good. These things are doing this like that. Look at you. You're watching a horror film on Saturday night, and the hairs on the back of your throat, the back of your neck go up. Why? You can argue when a dog gets scared or angry, it ruffles up all its fur, it actually looks a bit more scary. It's making itself look bigger than it actually is. But a bit of gooseflesh is not going to scare anyone. What's the point of that? Why have I got these nipples here? Why have I got these man boobs growing? What use are they to me? The evolutionary argument is, well, evolution starts with a common, well, development starts with a common program, and it's just kind of impossible to actually aggregate that program early enough to prevent these things happening. Basically, the differentiation of the sexes happens after the differentiation of the tissues into equals and so on. About 300 men every year get breast cancer in this country. So, you know, those breasts are not completely harmless. About the female clitoris and orgasm, well, we're in polite company, so we won't dwell on that, but there's a lot of arguments that are being put forward to say that those are vestigial features. They don't actually, the male orgasm is obviously evolved in the process of reproduction, whereas this is not. If we look in your genome, we can look at the genes in the genome, we can identify them, and we can see many genes which are clearly identifiable as genes, but they don't work. They're broken. Like they're misspelled in terms of work. We can see that the genes for vitamin C biosynthesis. So although we will say, oh, we have to have fruit, otherwise we get scurvy, in fact, our ancestors didn't have that problem, and many other mammals don't have that problem because they can make their own vitamin C. We have the remnants of the genes for making vitamin C, but they are broken, and we can see it. There are many, many genes for receptors for smell in your genome, which our ancestors, there was a kind of trade-off in primate evolution that we lost our sense of smell compared to a dog, but we've got a much richer sense of vision than they have. But we can still see all of those smell receptors encoded in the genome. We look at development, embryos of different species, much harder to distinguish than Now, I know the creationists will tell us that there was this guy, Haeckel, and he did all this thing with the embryos and made them look similar, more similar than they were and all that. But nonetheless, the fact is, if you take embryos and you look at them, it's very hard to tell the difference between a human and a dog and a fish at a very early stage later on. But again, we have this issue that as part of the developmental process, legless vertebrates, whales and dolphins, they actually get limb bugs, and they have these hind limbs up here, only to disappear to degenerate. This is a human embryo, and you can see that looks like a tail to me. It looks like a tail, it is a tail, isn't it? That's a tail. It then gets resorbed. And if you look carefully at the pathways of development and look at the anatomy, you can see all sorts of commonalities between humans, even down to fish. And the guy who discovered that fisherpod, Tiktaalik, Bill Shubin, has written a book called Your Inner Fish, which basically looks at your human anatomy through the template of a fish. And these pouches that feed the gills and gills of fish become what we call pharyngeal arches in human development. And one example here that is really particularly cogent is that there's this particular nerve, the recurrent laryngeal nerve, which is kind of caught. It was in fish. It actually goes. It just hooks around an artery, and it's not really going too far up this way. But as evolution has happened and mammals have evolved, that nerve actually gets caught in a kind of loop, in a knot around an artery that's down here in the thorax. So that nerve is going from the brain center, through down into the thorax, and then coming back up again to serve the larynx. Now, it could just go straight to the larynx. If we were designing it, as an engineer would design it, just design it to go straight to the larynx. Now, you might argue to go all the way to very down into your thorax and come back up again. It's only got a few inches out of its way. In the giraffe, it goes 15 feet out of its way. It goes all the way down the giraffe's neck and then all the way back up again. And this is an example of the kind of what we can see. We can make sense of this really only by looking at evolution and evolutionary history and the interaction between development and evolution. Atavism, this is the idea that you can see throwback sometimes. Hen's teeth. Hens sometimes have teeth, horses develop toes. Julius Caesar was supposed to have a horse that had toes. You sometimes see dolphins and whales that have hind limbs. Sometimes you do get humans with tails and humans with extensive body hair that makes them look like chimpanzees. And here's a recent example from the scientific literature where these people actually took chickens and they tried to get the chicken embryos to produce teeth again. And they succeeded by manipulating the genetics of the chick to actually get it to produce these teeth. Teeth that were very similar to those that you would see in the closest relatives that have teeth, which would be crocodiles. They showed in this paper there are many similarities at the structural level between the teeth that they induced in chickens and those in crocodiles. I've almost finished now. I'll just soldier on just the last few slides because there's some very important concepts. One is homology. So if we look at things like the arrangement of the bones in your limbs, in your arm, what we see is we see one bone, two bones, many bones, 5, let's say, as a general approximation. We see similar kinds of arrangements in all sorts of other settings. So in a dog, in a bird, in a whale. How do we explain that? The only real cogent explanation for that is evolutionary ancestry, similarity from a common ancestor. And in fact, evolution plays around, redevelops things, reinvents them in different ways in different settings. So you might say that a pterosaur, a bat, and a bird all have wings. They've all evolved those wings in different ways and actually redeploy and re-engineer the original kind of bones to create those wings. Superficially look the same, but actually and functionally they have many similarities, but they're actually being built in slightly different ways. Anyway, let's move on. So those are some of the things that were around at the time of Darwin. Since Darwin's time, we've discovered all sorts of things, all these things. I think we probably haven't got time to go through all of these. I mean, the main two things there. One is that we know about genetics now. We understand the basis we have. Darwin never did. The other one is that actually in Darwin's time, it was thought that the Earth was, although quite old according to Genesis times, but there's this guy Kelvin said, well, it can't be more than a million years old because they assumed that it was once the same heat as the sun and it was just cooling down. They didn't realise, they didn't know that there was radioactivity, they didn't know that heat was being generated inside the Earth. So there was this quite dynamic tension between Darwin's theory and Kelvin's ideas that basically maybe the world wasn't old enough, but we now know that it is. It's now billions of years old. The very last paper that Darwin wrote in his life, he published a few days before his death, shown here, on the dispersal of freshwater bivalves. It was about a little bivalve mollusk pitching a lift on the leg of a beetle. And interestingly, it doesn't quite co-author it, but you can't quite read that. But he mentions through it this man called Mr. W.D. Crick of Northampton. William Drawbridge Crick of Northampton. And it's one of those quirks of fate that this last person that Darwin mentions in print, in anything he ever wrote, turned out to be the grandfather of one of the men that actually took us forward into understanding DNA. This is Francis Crick. I met him once. I went to try and ask him non-plus. But he came up with the idea, he came up with the structure of DNA that basically depends that DNA is written in a kind of alphabet, if you like, and the proteins are then also produced by transcription and translation of that alphabet into another kind of alphabet we see in proteins. And so we now see that, I feel like all of life is written as a book in this kind of digital format, and we can actually look at that and make some more evidence for evolution than was there before. So what we see when we look at life is actually that the way in which that book's written, the alphabet in which it's written, is always the same. Pretty much. There's a few tweaks here and there. But if we give you I don't suppose anyone recognises that. That's Quechua. It's a South American language. It's a Native American language. Now you can see it's written in an alphabet that's not unfamiliar to you. Now, what would your explanation be if you went to South America and saw people writing this? You would not think, oh, that's independently been created. They come up with themselves. You'd say, well, it must have common descent with our Roman alphabet that we use. Maybe it's the missionaries and other educationists have actually created this alphabet for them. The same kind of argument, I think, applies to life, that life is always written in the same alphabet. And this must mean that there is common ancestry here. In fact, the interoperability of your genome and the way your DNA and proteins work and that of a bacterium is no more cogently shown than in the fact that insulin, which is given to millions of diabetics on which they depend for their life, it's human insulin, but it's made in bacteria, because you can take the human gene and you can stick it into a bacterium and you can get that bacterium to make insulin for you. So there's that interoperability. You try and take a component out of a Toyota car and try and get it to work in a Ford, it's usually not going to happen. But here, across huge spaces of evolutionary time between us and the bacteria, this kind of stuff still works. Now you could say, well, could it be any different? Maybe it has to be that way, because that's the only alphabet that actually works. But there's been recent research over the last few years showing that actually you can make DNA differently. You can make proteins differently. You can actually make the code, the genetic code, where the DNA, or the messaging nucleic acids gets turned into protein, you can make that work differently as well. So there's a huge chance of variability there, and yet all life is one. It all has the same kind of way of doing things. The other big breakthrough has been that you can actually look at those sequences and you can draw trees based on them. You can, if I say to you to be, you would say, well, maybe you're just saying something spontaneous. If I say to be or, where's that going? To be or not to be, well then I'm clearly plagiarising Shakespeare, aren't I? It's not my original way of saying things. And we see the same kind of thing if we look at the way in which we make a protein, say involved in protein synthesis, and the way in which a fruit fly makes it, and the the way in which a worm makes it, the way in which even a bacteria makes it, we can see profound similarities there, when in fact there's a huge amount of arbitrariness in the background, where you could have made it completely differently, and it would still work in a biological system, but it's not done that way. And in a sense, there's a great deal of similarity between this kind of idea of sequence homology and the ideas of plagiarism that we see in some kind of students. And this great tree of life now is really borne through. These are some of the representations of it. We can now extend Darwin's thinking about trees of life, not constrained just to plants, or not constrained just to animals, but to the whole of the biological universe, to bacteria, to slime molds, to humans. We can all be joined together in this tree of life. And if you look at our most closely related extant species, our closest relatives in the biological world, we can now see that looks to you, with intuition, the gorilla and the chimpanzee, they're clearly most closely related to each other. It's not true. Using this DNA and protein evidence, we now know that we and the chimpanzee share a common ancestor more recently than either of us do with the gorilla. That we think we're this kind of species apart. 6 million years to our common ancestor. And if we look at your genome, or we look at the chimpanzee's genome, we look at the proteins encoded within those genomes, we find, like, 2 spelling differences in each protein. So a protein, maybe 300 amino acids, we'll find a difference of 2 between you on average and that in a chimpanzee. One of those amino acid changes will have been on our line, one on the chimpanzee line. Now, speaking to this audience, I hope you're now persuaded that evolution is a fact. Also worth stressing that there are plenty of people out there that say, well, it may be a fact, but it's also sits perfectly well with their existing religious beliefs, and they can come to terms with it. Catholics, John Paul II said that basically this convergence results in independent studies that evolution is more than a hypothesis now, theory. The equivalent of the Anglicans in the US, headed up this woman who's actually a biologist, marine biologist, she makes these points. Interesting point. One of the first people to write to Darwin after the Origin of Species came out was an Orthodox Jewish man from Europe who wrote to Darwin in these terms here, rather florid terms here, and he actually tried to reconcile Darwin's Origin of Species with his studies of the Torah, and actually said that the two things were not in conflict at all. I think, by being generous, we'd say a rather idiosyncratic interpretation of the Torah to match Darwin. Creation of the species is a capitalist. I'll finish with a phrase which I haven't used up till now, which I think is actually the most eloquent part of the Origin of Species, the part that Darwin left at the very end, where he pointed out that there is grandeur in this view of life, several powers having been originally breathed forms or into one. And those of you who are still awake might notice there's a kind of allusion there to Genesis. Darwin actually got his knuckles wrapped for that later on. Breathed into a few forms or into one, and whilst this planet is on cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Let's be finished. Thank you very much. Yeah,